It's been 16 years since the last Friday the 13th movie came out. To put that fully into perspective for you, I was still putting glue on my hands to peel it off and pretend I was ripping pieces of my skin and handing them to fellow classmates to traumatize children and then laugh at their dismay. In other words, I was 19 at the time. Truthfully, I was still in elementary school, and I remember that DVD cover scaring the hell out of me at Blockbuster. And while Friday the 13th isn't my favorite slasher franchise, it was a huge part of my early fascination with the genre, and I have a whole lot of warm and fuzzy nostalgia for these movies. It's been a long time since we've gotten an official live-action Jason Voorhees, but that wait has finally come to a close with Sweet Revenge, an official short film written and directed by Mike P. Nelson, and the first proper Jason Voorhees thing to come out of the Jason universe umbrella, which is the result of a really annoying legal battle between Victor Miller and Sean S. Cunningham, the original creators of the franchise. The rights to this franchise are just all divvied up and in a really weird state right now, which is unfortunate, and that has caused Friday the 13th fans to wonder if they'll get another entry before they all wind up in nursing homes. Maybe. Mike P. Nelson was the guy behind that very divisive Wrong Turn remake that I actually liked quite a bit, and he's also set to release a reboot/remake of Silent Night, Deadly Night later this year. I'm still not entirely sure what direction they're going with that yet, but I'm excited. I love those movies. For now, though, we have this short film standing as the first time we've seen an official Jason Voorhees in live action in a long time, and so I wanted to just do a quick video talking about it. If you haven't watched Sweet Revenge, it's totally free on the Jason Universe YouTube channel, and it's only 15 minutes long, so please just go check that out, and then you can come back here after if you want to hear my thoughts on it. We need to show that there's interest in Jason so that more things can get rolling on feature films, and it's also just cool to have an official Jason Voorhees after waiting for so long. You can find it on their channel, but I'll also have it linked in the description, so go check that out and then come back here.
What kind of trouble?
Well, you know, the usual story. Revenge.
So these young, fleshy blood balloons-to-be arrive at what seems to be a lakeside rental for a weekend of Friday the 13th adjacent antics, such as skinny dipping, making out, dying, and drinking apple cider while wandering aimlessly in the forest. Alright then. You will almost certainly notice, especially throughout the first half of Sweet Revenge, that there is almost always Angry Orchard apple cider on screen, whether it's in a case or someone is actively drinking it. The short is sponsored by them, and they made sure that you wouldn't miss it, and you know what? It did kind of make me want to try some, but unfortunately it's not sold anywhere near me. This is very much so a Friday the 13th movie condensed down into 15 minutes, but there is something they do that actually sets this apart from any of the stories we've seen in this franchise before, at least in quite the way they did it here, but we'll get to that in a sec. Now look, I am very understanding of the fact that they had to cram a lot into a short window, so there's not a ton of time to properly flesh things out, but I think it probably would have helped if, with that in mind, they had managed to find a way to make the tone of the first chunk of the short feel more consistent. Through the intro, we have this fun, easygoing 80s music, and then that suddenly drops out when Eve is in the woods and is switched out for music that feels as close as you could get to the original Friday the 13th score without risking a lawsuit. The music is fine, but it's a really jarring moment. I think they probably would have been best off just choosing one tone for this short instead of trying to incorporate, you know, this easygoing summer fun vibe. You still could have had that, but maybe just a little more cohesively, since they've only got so much time here, and trying to stuff in everything about a Jason movie makes the first 2 minutes feel really wobbly. One thing I will say though is that while the short was clearly shot digitally, the film look conversion they did is pretty solid and gives a good, soft, filmic look to the short that definitely fits the sort of palette you'd want to see in a Friday the 13th movie. Although I'm not really huge on the sort of commercial approach to the cinematography here, I think the actual color palette and film look is solid. Before we get to the big man himself, I want to talk about something that the short does that I simultaneously respect and am confused by. If you've seen that Wrong Turn movie, then you know that Mike P. Nelson isn't really concerned with sticking to franchise conventions, and it seems like he had some ideas he wanted to explore here as well. It's not as extreme of a departure as that movie was, but it's still a little weird. So the first time I watched Sweet Revenge, I was deeply confused as to what the hell happened when Eve went onto the boat, was pulled into the water by Jason, and then emerged hours later. Like, it's dark when she comes back out, and at that point she has this darkness in and around her eyes that wasn't there before, and the short ends with her killing the girl who her boyfriend cheated on her with. Now, it seems like Mike P. Nelson wanted to bring in some biblical imagery as a form of foreshadowing here, which is not something I would usually expect in a Jason flick, with Eve eating this apple and then making sure it's heavily focused on. The apple being a symbol of the loss of innocence and the fall of humanity in the Bible, and, you know, her name being Eve, makes this pretty clear, and it seems like it was meant to set up Eve's upcoming fall into a darker side of herself where her innocence is lost. From what I can tell, Jason pulled her into the water, and just like he came out of that lake and went on to start killing, Eve is overcome with the same sort of darkness, shown visually and then full on when she finds it in herself at the end to kill her friend. It's a weird choice for this. I don't have a problem with Nelson wanting to try some new and weird shit for the franchise, but it's been so long since we've had one of these movies that I feel like this return really should have been entirely focused on a pure, tried and true depiction of Jason Voorhees, instead of trying to throw in some biblical storyline of Eve eating from forbidden fruit and then having some darkness awaken inside of her when Jason, like, I don't know, passes it onto her, or at least intentionally exposes her to it, knowing what it will do. Like, that just doesn't feel like it fits with Jason. I don't know, maybe what they're going for here is that Jason did kill her by drowning her, but they're trying to imply that the lake has something in it that made it so that Eve was resurrected after being killed. You get a moment at the end after Eve kills that chick in the car where Jason and Eve just stand in the road and stare at each other before Jason approaches her. That makes me think that the most likely explanation is the last one I mentioned, where she's resurrected by some strange thing in the lake. I guess it's kind of an interesting, like, proof of concept for a more fleshed out story, but again, I just don't feel like this was the time to pull out something like that when it's been so long since we've seen Jason. On that note, the handling of Jason himself is a fairly mixed bag. One of the things that happened pretty early on in that whole Jason universe thing is that Greg Nicotero, who's an iconic makeup effects artist trained by Tom Savini himself, was brought on to make a standardized design for Jason that will now be used across all depictions of him under the Jason universe umbrella, and it's okay. The mask kind of feels like something you'd find at a Halloween store to me. The bottom is too narrow, the breathing holes are off, the contours just don't really fit, and the eye holes are, I don't know, it just doesn't look all that good to me. It's certainly not the worst thing in the world, but I don't even know why you would bother standardizing Jason's look in the first place. It's not like a machete-wielding, hockey mask and ragged clothes-wearing zombie dude is going to be mistaken for anyone else, but again, it's not the worst thing I've ever seen. Seeing it here in action definitely shows more of its potential than the original reveal of the new design, and while I don't think Schuler White is necessarily a bad performer in the role, he's just not built for a character like Jason Voorhees. He's apparently 6'4" according to his IMDb page, but somehow he never feels imposing or all that much larger than anyone else while you're watching the short. Jason just looks kind of dorky, like someone you'd see come to your door on Halloween night. It just doesn't feel like you're looking at Jason Voorhees. He doesn't have all that much of a strong presence at any point, which is a real shame. I mean, hell, the short is even named after Eve's arc in the story, and not really much of a reference to Jason at all, so, like, the point of this whole thing wasn't even a focus on the dude we've been waiting to see for a long time. Now, what of the kills? A Friday the 13th movie can be narratively anemic or muddled, but if Jason is good and the kills are cool, it usually works just fine. Well, the kills that we actually see are really great and feel like classic, brutal Jason Voorhees murders. Something that I really appreciated was how well they managed the setup payoff aspect of these deaths, where it's not just random, really brutal kills, but you have the dude who gave Eve the apple earlier getting killed and having an apple stuffed into his mouth with his jaw broken open, which was dope and is fun on a second watch since the way he bites the apple is so aggressive. Part of me wonders if he bit so hard he broke his jaw by accident and then said, "That hurts." He also talked to this dude when the group first arrived and told him that the motor for the boat had just been tuned up, and he winds up getting the coolest death of the short, where he's crushed by a door and Jason takes the boat motor and just grinds his face in with it before chucking the blade at someone trying to run away. It's really cool, and the effect for it is gnarly as all hell, and it's that sort of creativity, not only in the kills themselves, but how they're set up with these characters that makes Friday the 13th movies so much fun. She doesn't die from it, but this chick getting an apple slicer pushed into her face was nasty as well. I'm also wondering if that was meant to be another piece of symbolism with her being sort of marked to reflect the ugliness inside of her for being willing to mess with Eve's boyfriend? Maybe, I don't know, after the apple thing, I'm not ruling anything out. Now, all of that being said, again, it has been 16 years since the last official, live action Jason Voorhees kill. There's no doubt that Friday the 13th is what caused slashers in the 80s to become as gory as they did, and the movies are home to some of the goriest and most iconic deaths in horror history. Jason is a beast, and Sweet Revenge had the chance to have the first official Jason Voorhees kill in over a decade and a half. And they decided to have our first 4 kills be off screen. Alright, so I'm currently editing this video, and I just realized that it was actually the first 5 kills. Imagine how insanely exciting it would have been for Jason fans to have a proper hulking Jason return with a balls-to-the-wall kill for his first showing in such a long time. That would have been a genuinely iconic moment in my opinion, but it feels like we were sort of robbed of that because of the fact that it doesn't feel like Sweet Revenge is structured as a short film as much as it was structured like a feature film and then crammed into 15 minutes, which just doesn't wind up working. Of course, that's not to say that Friday the 13th movies always have a jam-packed runtime with no fluff. I am certainly not saying that. Not by any stretch of the imagination. I know it sounds like I've been pretty rough on Sweet Revenge, but honestly, this comes from a place of love because I really do cherish this franchise. It's shot a little too commercially for my taste. The way Jason looks and his handle just really didn't land for me, but the kills themselves are great, and it's got a decent enough Friday the 13th vibe to it that I can still enjoy it from that angle. I just think it was a strange decision to have this weird, biblically symbolic fall from innocence and random resurrection of a character we only just met, but I would also be lying if I said I wouldn't be curious to see where Mike P. Nelson wants to take this, which is sort of the feeling I'm getting here. This seems to me more like a proof of concept for a feature film that Nelson has in mind than it does something that was conceptualized purely as a short film, and I think there's some genuine potential in the concept. I just don't think this was really the time to do it. Like what they're doing with Eve here I think could be the setup for a really cool final girl, like a great adversary for Jason, but I kind of just wanted to see a simple Jason short here. This should have been full blast Jason, imposing and brutal the whole way through, and while I wouldn't even go so far as to call it bad, it's sort of just which I really did not want to be how I felt walking away from the first live-action Jason Voorhees in such a long time. I really hope the stars can align and we can get a proper Friday the 13th movie again while I'm young enough to have functioning mental faculties, but things definitely could have been a lot worse than Sweet Revenge. There's that A24 Crystal Lake series that Victor Miller made a deal for, and while I'm somewhat curious about it, and I'll at least give it a shot, a narrative-driven TV series isn't exactly the sort of thing I go to the Friday the 13th franchise for, personally. Sweet Revenge is a decent enough short film with a couple of really great moments, but it sort of feels like Jason is peripheral here, which is a shame, and when he's on screen, he just doesn't have all that much impact. I wasn't even sure if I was going to cover this initially, since I would usually feel weird picking apart a low-budget short film, but since this is an official release under Jason Universe, I felt like there was more purpose in talking about it. I'd love to cover some more Friday the 13th stuff in the future, since I've never actually talked about them on the channel before, so let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.